So session 3, sustainable development for the 21st century. Now, in case some of you are wondering, we've gone from a very erudite keynote, which covered a lot of points, to commercial gallery world, and then we've gone into the institutional world, and now we're talking about design. One of the reasons for that is, as I explained at the beginning of the day, that to break out of this sort of silo of just talking about the contemporary art world from a contemporary art world perspective, and also to kind of reflect on the hybrid nature of this space in terms of showing design, showing different forms of art and craft, conservation, materials, and so on. So natural choice, when we first began starting to think about this, was having Bandana and Swarup along. And Bandana was someone who I met many years ago in the fashion industry, was a writer at Vogue India, and increasingly over the years is someone who has moved into the field of sustainability and activism and has really become a spokesperson, not just from the perspective of what's going on in this country, but also globally. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Swarup is a scenographer, vast experience in the fashion industry for many years, has again had a sort of chameleon-like, as many people do, I suppose, in their kind of trajectory. So I want to begin with you, Bandana. Going from writing about, catwalk trends and designers and what designers were doing and what was happening in the industry, and over the years, slowly and gradually kind of being more concerned about the industry. So rather than, let's say, an advocate and a champion, someone who became quite critical of what was going on. How did that happen? What changed?
Well, hello, everyone. I worked with Vogue magazine for 13 years at the forefront of creating the kind of trends that make you buy colors and bags and shoes. It was a wonderful experience. I've only gained a lot from my 13 years. But I think as part of our own self-evolution and our own growth, it became more and more disconcerting for me, especially as a citizen of this country, to talk about such immense wealth and so much money spent on shoes and bags, and you start thinking in terms of the equivalent value of what that money could do. Put more electricity in villages, build more toilets. I mean, you start wondering, because it is excessive consumerism. At the same time, it's the world that we live in now, not to talk about sustainable practices, not to address sustainability policies. We are going down the rabbit hole if we don't acknowledge that we cannot be sustainable human beings. This earth cannot survive if we continue to consume the way we do. Just to give you an example, 150 billion garments are made every year. 150 billion garments, which means each one of us and every human being on earth can have 20 new garments per year. Now that is abysmal, because we don't have an earth with that much resources, natural resources. We do not envision our world to be full of carbon dioxide, because it will if we continue to blindly consume. And so just these sort of realizations is what made me change my direction, with full gratefulness to my previous job for what I've learned. But now the path for me is definitely to be an activist, and I think we play a unique role when we come from India, and we can talk about this later, I don't want to take up too much time, is that we come from a country where sustainability was inherent to our culture. And we'll talk about that later, but just to let you know, this is my journey so far.
Swarup, you studied textiles at university, and you came back to India. You started working with young designers like Sabyasachi, who's become one of the kind of really great kind of ambassadors for Indian fashion around the world. But you've also held positions at the Dean of the School of Craft and Design. Do you see, sometimes, again, what we call the luxury fashion industry, then what you see happening on the high streets and perhaps happening in the hinterlands, do you see that reflected in education, or you simply taught trends and designs, and how does that sort of, how are we going to change things going forward?
Hello. Well, it's an interesting question. See, when institutions were set up in this country, especially fashion institutions, they basically took formats from Europe or America and kind of patched it up together. So we really didn't have a so-called policy to say what it should be. It was under UNDP funding, so it just went along and kind of copy-pasted curriculums. Interestingly, we were a space which was predominantly looked at as a space where you would re-engineer. Right? You look at a textile, you copy it. I'm talking about the industry format that was there when these institutions were set up. So, of course, even if it was a garment industry, eventually you were only making a couple of shirts. The whole planning was happening somewhere else. So you only were dealing with a part of the story. So you never had the larger picture revealed to you. And so the institutions also struggled to figure out what would they teach, to be relevant. So while they were educational institutions, they also became training institutes, and that line blurred a bit. Because while you were taught so many things, let's say you were taught how to plan a line, when a student would go to the industry, they would only deal with a part of it, and so the industry would deem it irrelevant. So it's only now that we have a domestic industry which is supporting it that we see the whole scheme of things. Of course, there were always a couple of sort of industries people who broke that chain and they kind of envisaged the larger picture. But I think the fact that now we have a domestic industry, a lot of what was taught is now relevant. Yeah.
Can I add to that? I mean, having worked in fashion for a while and been interacting with designers from top to bottom, student designers to very accomplished designers, I find there's inherently a problem in the way fashion has been treated as a discipline. I mean, we still have to argue that it is as artistic as painting, fine arts. We, as an industry in the fashion, we have sort of dehumanized fashion so much, fetishized it so much, that it's gone beyond the realm of our everyday, even though we change our clothes every day, even though we look at ourselves, and as Cecil Beaton said in the 1940s, when you decide what you want to wear in the day, you treat yourself as a work of art. That is your first act of art. But fashion, in its extreme snobbery in the spectrum, in the hierarchical way that fashion is treated, viewed, and implemented, we have just made it so far away from other realms. We've stopped cross-pollinating. There's architecture, art, there's food. Anything that is part of our social lives and our culture has seen collaborations. But with fashion, it's kept sometimes deliberately by the great fashion conglomerates because of the aspirational value, but it hasn't seeped in. And going back to our keynote speaker when he talked about, the pyramid structure and all the challenges that we have and the changes will only come if you don't look at the apex of the pyramid, but you look at the bottom of the pyramid and start working up from there. And in India, it's imperative because we are essentially a village economy. Pre-colonization, we were, as Gandhi would call it, he would love to have called it republic villages, village republics, because they were all ecosystems that existed and coexisted. So they were ecosystems where there were weavers and dyers and tailors, and it was a self-sustaining, Swadeshi environment, and that was a whole country. And post-colonization, of course, we know what kind of degradation that we went through. So we need to revisit the idea that working from the bottom means that we have to consider village economies that supply all the made-by-hand crafts. We have 11 million artisans in our country. That's bigger than a population of a big European country. And so we cannot look at fashion only from the top anymore. We have to talk about empowerment that starts from the base of the pyramid.
Do you see things changing? I mean, you've been speaking in Copenhagen at the Sustainably Fashion Summit, in Stockholm. You're speaking in Sydney soon about this subject. This is really now coming to global attention, right? It's not just about fashion, but it's about, generally globalized industries that are causing deprivation, waste. But there's also this question which we touched upon, which is about the eradication of indigenous skills and crafts, and how do you attribute, if you can imagine, and you've written about this before, that couture gowns are, labored over in studios in Bombay and so on, but they're unnamed and they're anonymous. It ends up in Paris and Milan, and they sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars in some case. And the people that are producing it, the skill set that went into producing the life, the way of life and the traditions and stuff are completely ignored. Do you see a redress, or do you think that's just the way it is now?
Well, the dialogue and the talks about this is just beginning, because we are now in an era of diversity, fluidity, where globalization is not necessarily the best thing that can happen. Individuality, indigenous matters. Being different is celebrated. So now cultural difference is celebrated. It's perfectly fine not to look like the other person. It's perfectly fine to belong to an exotic country, indigenous community, learn your own language, and be very proud about it. So the conversations now about all the stuff that are being made for big brands overseas, and the people who've made them, who've been so invisible right now, for this long rather, need to come out. So we have big global movements called Fashion Revolution, for instance, that has a tagline that says, "Who made my clothes?" It's imperative that we know that who made our clothes, also that we put a face to a faceless person who has been clothing us for decades. I don't want to take up... I'll wait for you to add.
I think I'm just going to sort of address the same question from a fairly grassroots level, because I've spent a lot of time sort of being with them, talking, working. I feel the problem is that all our craftsmen at a certain level have been disempowered. See, before they were in a context, so they were aware of the context that they're operating within, so they understood the nuances of it, what their customers wanted. They were close by, or they were patrons, who were asking for something. Suddenly, it's all broken loose. They have no semblance or an understanding of what to make, who are they making it for. And so it has been this interjection of designers, who I think have really helped in bastardizing things more than anything else, because they've come in with certain sort of hedonistic ideas and they've started imposing it. So these guys have been like super confused about what to make, who to make it for, and that is a huge void. Of course, taking on from what Bandana was saying, this whole issue of appropriation has become more topical because of legalities associated with it too. So let's say if you use a Peruvian textile and like Dior makes an outfit out of it, which is fine, you can obviously reference and use it. But as soon as that gets copyrighted, the communities who actually owned it can't go back to it and say it's a Peruvian textile, then it becomes a Dior textile. So which is alarming, and I think we are slow at this process. But I mean, of course, there's geographical indication that and IPR, which is being implemented by the government from the government level also. But I think maybe it is time, as she's saying, that there needs to be more collaborative and appreciative relationship rather than appropriating it.
Just to add to this, so intellectual property rights is just not sufficient for this, because it's not sufficient because it doesn't take into account culture. So in fact, there's a big movement now, and there is the first cultural intellectual property right institution that's come up now in Berlin. It started in Berlin. And it's become such an intense problem because it's not just about, as we said, it's not just about the fact that you don't give credit where it's due, right? So it's not like you can go around saying, oh, guess what, all the beautiful embroidery done on that Gucci jacket was all done in Rajasthan. So you're not allowed to say that, so it remains absolutely faceless. But no profit goes back, is injected back into a community that is sort of used over and over again for such high margin purchases. So all this will be taken into account because thank God for social media to such an extent that today you put out one gram picture and if there's something inappropriate, it just goes viral and you'll have thousands of comments and accountability. And I don't know if you kept in touch with Dolce & Gabbana, one of the top international brands, were very disrespectful about the Chinese communities. And overnight, their stores were shut. China, which is one of the biggest markets for Dolce & Gabbana, they didn't hesitate for a second to shutter their shops. They were even going to burn it.
But Dolce & Gabbana have been producing things in this country for years. I mean, apart from that scandal about it, she's talking about a little viral video. Now all the brands online do these little Instagram videos to help, engage with audiences, and they use influencers. And they had a Chinese person eating pizza with chopsticks, and this caused a huge furore and was seen as being extremely disrespectful. But the flip side of that, of China being now the largest, or still the second largest, but soon to be the largest luxury goods market in the world, basically turning off the tap.
Yeah, and the biggest clients. So accountability today is sort of, you can't escape it. Because it can come from an absolute faceless young person sitting in pajamas and commenting and noticing that something culturally inappropriate was done, or socially inappropriate was done.
But we're talking about international. Coming back to India now, there is a generation of designers today that are now on the international scene, right? It's people like Manish Arora, Sabyasachi, and then there are many designers who work domestically who aren't really that bothered about international markets, because here domestically the market is so strong, and clearly it's things like the wedding market. Now, clearly there are things and issues here that need to be addressed that are not being addressed by this group of stakeholders. So let's start at home, and where do you think we need to go from here? I mean, what do you think needs to be done to address some of these issues? Rather than talking about Dolce & Gabbana, let's talk about some of our own.
Let's talk about India. So what's the situation now? And I don't have to remind anyone, any magazine that you look at, any billboard, do you not feel that there is absurd Bollywoodization of Indian fashion and clothing? And there is absurd amount of costumization. Everywhere I look, it is always the bride and a very obsequious, subservient woman, always bedecked and dazzling. Where's the modern Indian woman? Where is the woman who actually enjoys handicraft clothes but made in a sophisticated way? It's either you buy the 20 lakh lehenga or you're going to Zara. I mean, I feel there's such a huge gap today in our market where we are not looking at fashion as fashion, an art form, or sort of catering to the needs of our times, responding to the needs of women and men of this day and age. It's either we are like lost in a lull of nostalgia, or we are hurtling towards fast fashion that allows you to buy a t-shirt for $3 thinking, oh, you paid so little. I'll tell you, someone is paying the cost. It may not be you. It could be a woman sitting in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in Cambodia, underpaid, with no rights of her own, with no living wages. Someone is paying the cost. And I think in India, with this absurd costumization and money and weddings and the Zarification of Indian of fashion, there's a big gap. I don't know. What do you think?
I also feel that it's also a question of power and who holds more power, who appropriates. So invariably, if you go to designer shows, we tend to do some events where the designers would obviously protest against us calling master weavers at the same platform. And there seems to be an inherent fear because at a certain level, there is this, I think they do feel that they have appropriated something which belongs to somebody else, and you've just gone and picked it up, and you started making something out of it. And interestingly, we've kind of glorified that. Instead of, you see, it's kind of a lopsided equation. It belongs to somebody, someone goes, picks it up, of course, does some changes to it, and then takes it forward. But you brand it as that person's, as opposed to the community who's been practicing it for that many years. So instead of the designer taking pride in borrowing, it's the artisans are made to feel like, okay, so if there's chicken curry that a designer is using, that's a great thing, and I just feel that whole equation's completely lopsided.
Worked for the fashion Bible, right? And you weren't, obviously you're working for Vogue India, but Paris, New York, Milan, you do all the shows every season, so that's twice a year, plus couture, plus the special trunk shows, and so on and so forth. And the size of the industry, so huge, and what Dr. Chakravarti mentioned this morning, the society of the spectacle, and really the mediatized age that we live in. But it does seem to me the glorification of Zarification of fashion, if you like, this sort of looking outward from, things that we have here, sustainable things, things that are produced in this country, fashion magazines and the media and Bollywood and things tend to ignore in pursuit of this aspirational so-called luxury lifestyle, which is kind of disjointed from this idea that you can wear, a pair of juti that is handmade in Rajasthan and they can be fixed when they break. They don't need to be thrown out, right? And that, so where do we lay the blame here? Is it the media? Is it the designers? Is it consumers?
I think we all have a certain role to play. I mean, we can look at the manufacturers and say, why don't they have compliance rules? Why do you not look after your the labor? We can look at media and say, why is media just talking about a world that exists in La La Land and we don't have editorial narratives that actually reflect our present, right? I mean, do we always have to go to Switzerland it's like Bollywood. I mean, how many times do we have to go to Switzerland as a backdrop? Or so that the sense of reality, so people like me who are journalists, I've written these exorbitant stories that look beautiful but have no grounding in reality. Is it designers? Are they just chasing profitability and little accountability? I think they're players along the value and supply chain that everyone needs to address.
I actually used to go to Shapurjat a lot. It was a lovely place to visit. You had such lovely, quaint brands who were working out of it. And if you visit now, it's very interesting how that whole space has been made into a complete sort of a extended bridal studio. All you have is just bridal shops. And it's interesting that the business format also is not supporting these designers who want to do interesting, different things, because while they were making their clothes, and the rentals went up every year, they couldn't, and so they had to move out, and the bridal shops, sort of came in because their per piece value in terms of sales could sort of justify the rentals. So I think the commercial model per se also is not working at the moment in favor of of designers who want to experiment. Of course, there is more, it's opening up, there are a lot more exhibition spaces where they're showing, but even to hold a permanent shop is a challenge. To have a studio of your own is a challenge.
Is this a discussion that is taking place in your fraternity? Or is this happening sporadically, activism on one end, and, people like Bandana, people like yourself in teaching and, more grassroots efforts, and others who are not involved in the industry per se, but are preserving crafts and local traditions? And it seems to me that everybody the fashion industry hasn't come together per se, has it, to tackle this issue in this country, or has it?
Fashion is notorious for taking any issue and making it into a trend. The moment you make anything into a trend, it passes away. So what happens is fashion has talked about gender, fashion has talked about fluidity, fashion has talked about LGBTQ rights, fashion talks about handmade culture, all of it. But they dip into it and dip out of it, so it becomes sloganism by the end of it. Then you can have it on your T-shirt, wear it for 3 days, and you think you're a feminist. But it lacks the consistency to actually stand for a cause. Every time the world order changes and we talk about gender inequality, you can't just put a man in skirts and say, hey, look, we stand for gender equality. It's a much larger commitment that we are talking about. So in my very frugal opinion, I would love to hold magazines up for lack of participation and just sort of dipping into things because it's just the thing that you have to talk about for the moment because it's almost like it may go viral. And there's no real commitment to hang on to somebody's rights. So when we are standing up for LGBTQ rights, you're talking about policy changes, you're talking about consistent coverage, representation in the magazine, so that we need to see the LGBTQ as mainstream. So it's not just the other.
Isn't there an inherent kind of paradox or kind of, inconsistency in that the global fashion industry needs to grow, right? And in order for it to grow, people need to keep consuming. So if you're advocating a scenario where people consume less, and there is this trend, if you like, where people are starting to upscale old garments, starting to recycle garments, the second-hand industry and so on, people are starting to buy less in certain situations, or at least being encouraged to buy as much as they used to. But isn't that run counter to the profit motive of companies? So how are you going to sell this to an industry or any industry that relies on growth?
I have to contradict you on this. There is no reason to believe that the industry has to grow and grow till it bursts in the seams and God knows what confetti is going to come out. It's already a $4 trillion industry. I think it's the idea of changing our ideology to make it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. When did that become such a valuable thing in our lives? The idea is you buy less, which is possible, buy more valuable stuff that you're going to keep for longer. You're going to pass it down. But you can't possibly think the world is going to sustain itself if you keep picking up those $3 t-shirts and putting it under your closet, or worse, throwing it because billions of pieces of garment go into our landfills. And they toxify the earth, our water supply gets ruined. It's just a basic disaster. So the idea of, it's like saying being rich is not enough. I've got to be richer and richer. We have a very rich industry. It can afford to focus on selling less, making less.
Is that going to happen?
I've been ordering food because my cook's been away for a while, and so Zomato happens every day. And so every time you eat, there are that many containers which go into a plastic sheet. And I was just thinking that in a month, whatever I've consumed, the amount of plastic that I've generated myself, and it's alarming. You yourself feel shy, but you don't know what to do about it. Do I send a dabba out, where food should come to me? I don't know. So in the void of that system, it's churning itself out. So interestingly, there are trends internationally, and unfortunately we tend to follow them, where instead of like churning out fashionable furniture, accessories, you buy things which shows quality. You don't paint it over, so you don't know what material it is. When you're buying it, you see the wood, you see the material. You know it's going to be there with you for longer. You value it. I think clothing can take that route. Traditionally, it has always been like that with us. It's just that I think we're kind of going through this a bit of a schizophrenia at the moment. I think we just need to be reintroduced to this. I mean, my mother still wears saris, and there are no fashion trends to it. They're all lovely, beautiful. You just wear it according to your mood, what you want to wear. And it's there with you. Also, it's very interesting that in terms of fashion, the trends also play a major role. So if you're younger, you tend to, you want things to change faster. And so the quick fashion has taken root. Of course, like if you buy something which you want to wear for a longer time, it would be classic. It has to be. So then style takes precedence over sort of, trends. And I think that is a phase. I think we are sort of coming to a cognition of where we want to buy things which maybe are expensive, but which will be with us for longer.
Any questions or comments from anybody? Pinakin.
It's working? Just an observation more than a question, that isn't what we've been discussing, most of the things since morning, isn't it pointing to a direction which says that we are a time-poor society and that basically we've all got down to living for the moment. So if a teenage girl's highlight is just to take an additional selfie for herself today, perhaps she needs the $3 t-shirt, because then she can't wear the classic sari and over 5 selfies or 50 selfies. So I think, does culture need individual fixes or does it need a larger holistic fix, is what I'm throwing up.
I think we need a larger holistic fix. Here, this is not a competition about are you going to wear Western clothes or Eastern clothes. This is not that. You can take a selfie in a sari. You know, I love saris, but do I wear it every day? I don't. But we need to collectively believe that what we have as our topic, our main topic, is that we cannot live in a world of us and the others anymore. And in fashion, it is so obvious because it's such a visual medium, right? I mean, we have propped fashion to such a high standard of sort of unavailability to the common person that we have made it into an us and them situation. When the fact of the matter is, yes, we could just be talking about a t-shirt, but what if that t-shirt is being made by someone who may just lose her life while making it? And this has been shown in Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, you know, and most of them are women. So clothing business has become a human rights issue and a gender issue, because 80% of our clothes are made by women. And in Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, when the whole building tumbled down, it tumbled down because there was no standards, none. And they were making the t-shirts that you're probably wearing now. So
actually, that's a very interesting point. I feel that, you know, I could afford more because it's priced less. But if I couldn't, you know, would I not make do with what I would have and do the best with it? So the question is that, you know, because it's available for cheap, we go and buy it. But if it would be, you know, keeping in mind that somebody needs to be paid the right wages and all other, you know, sort of adherences need to be made, maybe, you know, it would be a different picture altogether. I mean, you could still buy it, but at least you know that, you know, the rest is in line. And I think we are increasingly ready to pay that price. It's just that we don't have that cognition, you know, it becomes a format. You do it because everybody is doing it, and there's no reflecting time. And I think once you start reflecting, the change happens, even at an individual level, you know. Like me looking at those canisters every day and thinking, what do I do with this, you know? Like how many, you know?
I agree completely with Bandana that the fashion industry just has to be radically tipped over onto its head. I love clothes, I love textile, I love fabric, I love cut, I love silhouette, I hate fashion. And I think what's happened is that you had this kind of, and I cannot understand the seasonal change where the East has aped the West without the climate to support that kind of even thinking in that way. And if you just look at the number of leftovers on sales, and especially in Western store, and you start even questioning that, and how much goes into just landfills is ridiculous. We're not going to be able to ever sustain, but your answer to Pinakin is that you just have to change. There's no alternative. Now, the other thing about the markup that happens when you use craftspeople and it goes into high fashion is that the Tata Trust, we work in our crafts program, and one of the things that my colleague works with is that this market linkages. It's supposed to be that, the craftsman can't get into the market, and we've cut out the middleman, supply him with the material so that he can do it himself, and so you design a program where you enable him to get onto social media and do all this. But I don't think that's enough. You can get them onto social media, get them into direct contact with the designers, but the markup the designers put is obscene. And there has to be policy in place that the craftsman has to get a percentage of that markup. It's only then will you have the sustainability of the craft. So if you have a craftsman selling something to the designers or working and getting a wage of, say, 10 rupees, and the designer is going to go and sell it for 1,000 rupees, he has to be given 20% of that, or he has to be given 10% of that. And that's where policy change comes in. And I think the fashion world really has to think because the ethical issues through, and it's just shocking how it's gone under the radar for so long.
Absolutely. Do you want to comment, Bandana? We've got a few more minutes. Give Dr. Chakravarti. Do you want to make your comment and then we can make final remarks on the stage?
Well, you see, intellectual property right. You know, in Australia, this Supreme Court gave a decision in the Milpururu case, deciding for Aboriginal designs, that the rock art designs borrowed on shirts, they had to be compensated. I mean, so a similar PIL in the court should achieve this objective with this obiter dicta. The secondly, you know, government support. You see, in the Lalit Kala Academy, we worked on, among others, 2 projects here, in which the crafts people working with contemporary artists directly, both in the Puja festival as well as on the Chitpur Road, 19th century Chitpur Road. So we brought them together to promote exhibitions in the Triennale and the Biennale. So that was possible, and it was coming out beautifully. But then, of course, it gets sabotaged. And then you see, thirdly, you see this convergence of arts is easily possible and negotiable. The Skill India project, see where it has gone. The Skill India project is based on machine learning. And machine learning to feed a few corporate pockets like Bangalore, Ahmedabad, etc. And I have tried to advise, without, of course, any success, that these boys and girls, they go to a city and come back, you know, alienated, neither able to absorb themselves there because these are small pockets, nor able to function here. This skilling should have been done based on the local resources and the local designs. So there should be another, you see, agitational approach to de-skill this Skill India project. Because this Skill India project is entirely a misconcept. I mean, because it doesn't feed the hinterland communities at all.
Thank you.
They train, get them into these pockets of industrial.
Bandana, do you want to, you've been increasingly speaking on Gandhian philosophy.
How many minutes do you have?
Can you
I'll
sum
make
up?
it very short.
Yeah.
So I do this talk, I travel around the world giving this talk, which is basically about Gandhi and fashion. And it's an extremely interesting topic because why would you think you'd put Gandhi and fashion in the same plate? But Gandhi had played a very powerful role with his clothes. In fact, while I was doing my research, I found a paper written by Professor Gonzalez from the Rome University, and it says, Half-Naked Fakir, Gandhi's Quest for Sartorial Integrity. I didn't even know what sartorial integrity meant at that time. And basically, it was Gandhi's quest for truth through his clothes. So we all know Gandhi's journey, so I'm not going to go on and on about it, but right through his life, from England to South Africa to India, his clothing changed from wanting to be like a Brit with his 3-piece suit to wearing the morning dress, which is white kurta and white dhoti in South Africa, all the way to India. During its abject poverty, during colonization, he became the half-naked fakir with just the loincloth. And all this he did to identify with the poorest of the poor. And every time his ideology changed, his commitment grew, his robing and the disrobing happened, till he became what Winston Churchill, very disparagingly said, you half-naked fakir, and Gandhi thanked him because he said, now you understand, now you see that I can identify with the poorest of the poor. I am the half-naked fakir. So this journey is extremely powerful, and nowhere in the history of of clothing or politics will you be able to find a story as powerful as Gandhi and his clothes. And this is thanks to Dr. Gonsalves that it just opened my eyes. So that got me to working around all the things that Gandhi believed in, all the words and notions that we as in India grew up with, Swadeshi, Swaraj, Aparigriha, Sarvodaya. You know, we heard it at some point in our lives, but have we been able to apply it in our lives? And because I work in the fashion world, I thought, can we apply this? And we certainly can. And I can go on, but I'll leave you with just ahimsa, for instance. Ahimsa is at the root of sustainability talks. It is at the root, because Gandhi himself said, ahimsa is not like a garment that you put on and take off at will. It must be seated in your heart and must be intrinsic to yourself, ahimsa. Now, ahimsa is such an important notion that we can apply in luxury and in consumerism and capitalism, because it's all about being nonviolent in deed, action, and purpose, right? So it talks about the environment. Gandhi and the way he talked about ahimsa influenced some of the biggest green movements. The peace research of Dr. Galtung was influenced by Gandhi, and this is all based on ahimsa. The economics of E.M. Schumacher, the most famous E.M. Schumacher, was based on Gandhi's ideas of ahimsa. So we need to revisit. These are no way new ideas that I'm proposing, but we need to reintroduce ahimsa in the way we buy things, the way we consume things, the choices that we make, because ahimsa actually talks about a very circular economy. Right now, what we do is linear. We take, we make, we waste. And ahimsa teaches us you take, you make, you take, you make. It's a cycle where the death of one life cycle of a product is the journey of a new life cycle of another product. So that is the circular economy that you hear about it all the time. And ahimsa sits at the heart of this philosophy and this economic practice. So I will leave you with that, if you want to add.
I think you've summarized it well. I also feel that intrinsically our hegemonies of class and caste is kind of built into us. And even at an institutional level, I'd just give you a quick example. We used to do craft documentation, so students would go to craft pockets, document the crafts, come back. And so there's one group who came back saying, like Begumpuri, saris, which are one of the sort of more frugal saris from Bengal, are dying out. And so when we probed it, we figured that there are these sahukars who pay them, and now instead of making those saris which don't yield as much profit, they've given them collar knitting machines, and so they're knitting collars, okay? But they make more wages doing that than making the sari, So broke a conversation, in the session that, so what, what happens if they're making more money and it's the same guy who's supporting them and the sari is not selling as much, can they not make collars? So, the student community sort of, by and large, said, no, it should not happen, okay? So it's like, tradition and, they should stick to it. So I very, very unassumingly just said that, so why don't you go ahead and weave, they can't, they're making more money, you weave. He said, no, but we're designers. You see, so that hegemony that somebody else will do it is so ingrained in us that actually becomes a first step of disparity, I feel. And I think once that is addressed, I think all of it, if you value others, I would say yes, like I value you, come. I think I must be 21 when I visited Santa Fe. And I loved the way the artists and the artisans work together, in the same studios, there's constant exchange, there's conversation, and there's value. But I think if you don't value, I would always shun you. If I value you, I would embrace you. So I feel that the hegemony is something which I think we need to really kind of, hit at the bud.
Thank you, Swarup, and thank you, Bandana. Thank you all very much. We're going to break for tea now, and then the next session will start at 4 p.m. Thank you.